The pride and utter confidence which the Titanic inspired may seem misguided, arrogant, even insane today. Yet the vessel, British-built and American-owned, embraced all the feelings of achievement of her age. The world was stunned when she sank in the early hours of April the 15th, 1912, with the loss of more than 1,500 lives. A product of Harland and Wolff shipyard in Belfast, the Titanic was the largest ship and her best cabins were sumptuously fitted out. Her 2,227 passengers and crew could have been filled with only pride when she set sail from Southampton to New York on her maiden voyage on the 10th of April 1912. That optimism and confidence was still much in evidence as she crossed the Atlantic, even when her wireless operators began to receive warnings of ice from ships ahead of her. Wireless was in its infancy, and messages between ships were sent by Morse code. Range was limited, and signals were passed from ship to ship or from ship to shore stations to reach their destination, all of which served to hamper the transmission of news after the tragedy. The range of the sending equipment on the Cunard liner Carpathia, which picked up all the survivors from the Titanic, was just 150 miles. She was too far away to communicate directly with the shore, but transmitted messages through the Titanic's sister ship Olympic. Although not out to break the record for crossing the Atlantic on this occasion, it appears that Mr. J. Bruce Ismay, managing director of the White Star Line, which owned the Titanic, had decided what speeds the Titanic was to maintain on her maiden voyage. The ship's course was, however, acceptable for the time of year. At the time of the collision, the Titanic was travelling at 22 knots, or 26 to 27 miles an hour, an incredible speed for a ship of its size. She might have taken a mile to come to a stop, certainly further than her lookouts could have seen into the distance on this moonless night. In those days, wireless was but a recent addition to the equipment of ships at sea. We were quite proud of our installation, though it had a normal range of only 130 miles and just over 200 miles in exceptionally favourable circumstances. And we only carried one operator. This man should have finished duty at midnight, yet here he was at 12:30, and he was still listening in, but he was on the very point of retiring. He was, in fact, in the act of bending down to undo his boots when the dread call came, for in his interest he still retained the phones upon his ears. SOS Titanic calling. We have struck ice and require immediate assistance. One can imagine him, jerking upright, the alarm growing in his mind, though to be sure in those first minutes we none of us permitted our fears to embrace so devastating an accident as it was destined to prove. But it was the Titanic, a mammoth ship proudful in her size and power, carrying over 2,000 souls and making her maiden voyage from England to America. That was sufficient to impress on the operator the magnitude of the danger, and throwing the earphones on the table, he raced to the first officer who was on watch at the time. It is a dramatic thought that if the signal had been 2 or 3 minutes later, we wouldn't have picked it up. The news was at once brought to me. Curious how trivial things stamp themselves on the mind in moments of crisis. I can remember my door opening, the door near the head of my bunk which communicated with the chart room. I had but recently turned in and wasn't asleep, and drowsily I said to myself, "Who the dickens is this cheeky beggar coming into my cabin without knocking?" Then the first officer was blurting out the facts, and, you may be sure, I was very soon wide awake, with thoughts for nothing but doing all that was in the ship's power to render the aid called for. So incredible seemed the news that, having at once given orders to turn the ship, we were bound from New York to Gibraltar and other Mediterranean ports, while the Titanic was passing us westward bound, 60 miles to our northward. I got hold of the Marconi operator and assured myself that there could have been no mistake. "Are you sure it is the Titanic that requires immediate assistance?" I asked him. "Yes, sir." But I had to ask again, "You are absolutely certain?" For remember, the wireless was not at the pitch of perfection and reliability it is today. "Quite certain," he replied. "All right," I said then. "Tell him we are coming along as fast as we can." I went into the chart room, having obtained from the operator the Titanic's position. It was latitude 41 degrees 46 minutes north, longitude 50 degrees 14 west. I at once worked out the course and issued orders. Within a few minutes of the call, we were steaming all we knew to the rescue. The Carpathia was a 14-knot ship, but that night, for 3.5 hours, she worked up to 17 knots. One of the first things I did, naturally, was to get up the chief engineer and explain the urgency of matters, and calling out an extra watch in the engine room, every ounce of power was got from the boilers, and every particle of steam used for the engineers, turning it from all other uses, such as heating. Fortunately, it was night. Fortunately, I mean, from one aspect, all our passengers were in their bunks. Many never woke up until the drama had been played out, because one of my first instructions was that, as far as possible, absolute silence should be maintained, while every man was told to instruct any passengers seen about to return to their cabins and stay there. There was much to be done. All hands were called, and then began over 3 hours of restless activity and never-ending anxiety. For though, as I say, it was fortunate that our passengers were asleep, the covering of night added to the risks we had to take. Ice, racing through the dark towards we knew not what dangers, from bergs, standing on the bridge with everyone keeping a bright lookout. I was fully conscious of the danger my own ship and passengers were sharing. I may say now that the spring of that year was phenomenal in regard to ice. The Titanic was on her right course, of course, where, it is true, one at times may see ice, but that night was so exceptional as to be unique in anyone's memory. The reason was that 2 summers before the season had been unusually warm in the far north. Islands of ice had broken adrift from their polar continent and come drifting south. It took 2 years for these giant remnants to work their way so far south, and we were amazed when daylight broke to find on every hand berg and floe stretching as far as the eye could reach. Into that zone of danger we raced the Carpathia, every nerve strained, watching for the ice. Once I saw one huge fellow towering into the sky quite near. Saw it because a star was reflected on its surface, a tiny beam of warning which guided us safely past. If only some such friendly star had glistened into the eyes of the lookout on the Titanic. Ah, well, it was not to be. Before I could take the bridge, however, there were 1,001 things to be done. They started at once. Even as I stood in the chart room working out the position, I saw the bosun's mate pass the watch off to wash down decks. I called him, told him to knock off routine work and get all our boats ready for lowering, not making any noise. Questioning surprise leapt into his eyes. "It's all right," I assured him. "We're going to another vessel in distress." The first officer I called, as I said, was the engineer. The speed was the imperative need. When he had gone to turn out his extra watch, and as soon as the men heard what was wanted and why, many of them went to work without waiting to dress, good fellows. I had up the English doctor, purser, and chief steward, and to these I gave the instructions as follows. The English doctor to remain in the first-class dining-room, the Italian doctor in the second-class dining-room, and the Hungarian doctor in third, all to have ready supplies of stimulants, restoratives, and other necessities. Purser, with his assistant purser and chief steward, to receive the rescued at the different gangways, controlling our own stewards and assisting the Titanic passengers to the different dining rooms for accommodation and attention. They were also to get as far as possible names of survivors to be sent by wireless. The inspector, steerage stewards and masters-at-arms to control our own steerage passengers, keep them out of the third-class dining hall, and to restrain them from going on deck. Chief steward to call all hands and have coffee ready for our men, and soup, coffee, tea, etc. for the rescued. Blankets to be placed ready near gangways, in saloons and public rooms, and others handy for the boats. All spare berths in steerage to be prepared for Titanic's third-class passengers, while our own steerage occupants were to be grouped together. To all it was enjoined that the strictest silence and discipline should be maintained, while a steward was to be stationed in each gangway to reassure our own passengers should any hear noise and inquire. Such inquirers to be asked politely but firmly to return to and remain in their own cabins. Here I might mention the experience of Mr. and Mrs. Lewis Ogden, friends of mine who were on board that night. They occupied a deck cabin, and it was only to be expected that they should hear something of the preparations that were going forward. The experience was duplicated many times, of course, by other passengers, though while all these things were being done, the great majority of those on board slept peacefully, unaware of our exertions, a great credit to the crew. Mr. Ogden told me later that during that night his wife woke and aroused him. "What's that noise on deck?" she asked. "Don't worry, go to sleep." The average man's reply to the anxious wife at such an hour, but, like other ladies, she wasn't to be so summarily silenced. "Open the door and see what's wrong." Mr. Ogden obeyed the injunction. Outside was a steward. Mr. Ogden called him. "What's all this noise about?" he asked. "Nothing, sir. Doing work with the boats." "What for?" Mr. Ogden was growing interested. "I can't tell you, sir." Mr. Ogden retired, and quite naturally only made his wife's suspicions increase. She waited a few minutes listening to the noises, which was inevitable as our boats were swung out on their davits. "Try again," she requested at length. This time Mr. Ogden, peeping out, encountered the surgeon. "What's the trouble?" "There's no trouble. Please return to your cabin. It's the captain's orders." Which didn't delay doubts. Going back and repeating the conversation to the wife, they both began to dress, putting their valuables in their pockets. Then the lady's insistence recommenced. "Try again." Once more Mr. Ogden opened the door, and, curiously enough, he again looked into the face of the surgeon. No need for questions. The surgeon ordered him back and told him on no account to leave the cabin until the captain gave instructions. But the passenger was urgent, and at length, as the only method of satisfying him, the surgeon said, "We are going to the Titanic. She's in distress." "But isn't this ship in distress?" "No, sir. It's the Titanic. She's struck ice." But then Mr. Ogden saw stewards in line carrying pillows and blankets. "There's something wrong," he concluded. And somehow he and Mrs. Ogden reached the deck. There they found some nook or corner and remained through the hours until, with the coming of the first gleams of dawn, they saw the ice and eventually the first boat. Meanwhile, we were plying on through the night, a brilliant night of stars. I had been able to go to the bridge. To me, there, Marconi operator came reporting he had picked up a message from the Titanic to the Olympic, asking the latter to have all her boats ready. The sense of tragedy was growing. But the Olympic, homeward bound, was hundreds of miles away, very much farther than we were. The Titanic had also called us. They asked how long we should be getting up. Say about 4 hours, I told the operator. We did it in 3.5 hours. And tell her we shall have all our boats in readiness and all other preparations necessary to receive the rescued. I then gave the following orders to the first officer: prepare and swing out all boats, all gangway doors to be opened, a block with line rope hooked in each gangway, a chair slung at each gangway for getting up sick and injured, pilot ladders and side ladders at gangways and over the side, cargo falls with both ends clear and bights secured along ship's side on deck for boat ropes or to help people up. Lines and gaskets to be distributed about the decks to be handy for lashings, etc., forward derricks to be rigged and topped and steam on winches, to get mails or other goods on board. Oil to be poured down lavatories both sides to quiet the sea, canvas ash bags to be near gangways for the purpose of hauling up children or helpless, company's rockets to be fired from 3 a.m. every quarter of an hour to reassure the Titanic. And beyond these, detailed instructions as to the various duties of the officers should the situation require the service of our boats. At about 2:35, roughly 2 hours after the first call, the doctor came to the bridge and reported that all instructions were carried out and everything was in readiness. While we were talking together, I saw a green flare about a point on our port bow. "There's her light," I cried, pointing. "She must be still afloat." This looked like good news. An hour before, the Marconi operator had brought me a message from the Titanic that the engine room was filling. That had looked fatal. It left little doubt that she was going down. So to catch that green flare brought renewed hope. Almost at once, the second officer reported the first iceberg. It lay 2 points on the port bow, and it was the one whose presence was betrayed by the star beam. More and more now were we all keyed up. Icebergs loomed up and fell astern. We never slackened, though sometimes we altered course suddenly to avoid them. It was an anxious time, with the Titanic's fateful experience very close in our minds. There were 700 souls on the Carpathia. These lives, as well as the survivors of the Titanic herself, depended on a sudden turn of the wheel. As soon as there was a chance that we were in view, we started sending up rockets at intervals of about a quarter of an hour, and when still nearer, fired the company's Roman candles, or night signals, to let them know it was the Carpathia that was approaching. Occasionally, we caught sight of a green light. We were getting pretty near the spot. By this time, the hope that their green signals had at first bred in us was gone. There was no sign of the Titanic herself. By now, it was about 3:35 a.m., we were almost up to the position, and had the giant liner been afloat, we should have seen her. The skies were clear, the stars gleaming, with that brightness which only a keen, frosty air brings to them, and visibility was as good as it could be on a moonless night. I put the engines on the standby so that the engineers should be on the alert for instant action. At 4 o'clock I stopped the engines. We were there. As if in corroboration of that judgment, I saw a green light just ahead of us, low down. That must be a boat, I knew. And just as I was planning to come alongside, I saw a big berg immediately in front of us, the second officer reporting it at the same moment. I had meant to take the boat on the port side, which was the lee side, if anything, though there wasn't much wind or sea. But the iceberg altered the plan. It was necessary to move with the utmost expedition. I swung the ship round, and so came alongside the first of the Titanic's boats on the starboard side. Devoutly thankful I was that the long race was over. Every minute had brought its risk, a risk that only keen eyes and quick decisions could meet, but with that feeling was the veritable ache which the now certain knowledge of the liner's loss brought. No sign of her. And below was the first boat containing survivors. A hail came up from her. "We have only one seaman in the boat and cannot work very well." They were a little way off our gangway. "All right," I told them, and brought the vessel right alongside. Then they started climbing aboard. Obviously they had got away in a hurry, for there were only 25 of them, whereas the capacity of the boat was fully 40. They were in charge of one officer. I asked that this officer should come to me as soon as he was on board, and to him I put the heart-rending inquiry, knowing with a terrible certainty what his answer was to be. "The Titanic has gone down?" "Yes," he said. One word that meant so much that the man's voice broke on it. "She went down at about 2:30. An hour and a half ago. Alas, that we hadn't been nearer." But there was no time for vain regress. Daylight was just setting in, and what a sight that new day gradually revealed. Everywhere were icebergs. About a third of a mile on our starboard beam was the one that a few minutes ago had faced us. Less than 100 feet off our port quarter was a growler, a broken-off lump of ice 10 to 15 feet high and 25 feet long, but stretching as far as the eye could reach were masses of them. I instructed a junior officer to go to the wheelhouse deck and count them. 25 there were, over 200 feet in height, and dozens ranging from 150 down to 50 feet. And amid the tragic splendor of them as they lay in the first shafts of the rising sun, boats of the lost ship floated. From that moment we went on picking them up, and as the rescued came aboard, their thankfulness for safety was always mingled with the sense of their loss and the chattering cold that possessed them. Many of the women had been hours in those open boats, shielded from the almost Arctic cold only by a coat hastily thrown over night clothes, telling of the urgency with which they had left the ship, suggesting to the imagination awful, long-drawn-out anxiety before the slips were loosed and the boat was on the water and away. Slowly we cruised from boat to boat, and as we neared the end of our questing, one gathered the enormity of the disaster. Altogether, we picked up 705 persons, but on the Titanic, crew and passengers numbered over 2,000, so many hundreds lost who a few hours before had been members of a gay and distinguished company halfway through the maiden voyage of one of the world's largest liners. While we slowly cruised, we held a service in the first-class dining room in memory of those who were lost and giving thanks for those who had been saved. Except for the boats beside the ship and the icebergs, the sea was strangely empty. Hardly a bit of wreckage floated, just a deck chair or two, a few lifebelts, a good deal of cork, no more flotsam than one could often see on a seashore drifted in by the tide. The ship had plunged at the last, taking everything with her. I saw only one body in the water. The intense cold made it hopeless for anyone to live long in it. It wasn't for us to remain, especially as about this time, 8 o'clock, we saw another ship coming. This was the Californian, and all the night had been lying not many miles away, hove to because of the ice. We signalled her now, asking her to continue searching as we were about to make for New York. The sea was rising, and I was anxious to get well away from that danger zone in good daylight. So we got as many of the Titanic's boats as we could on board, some remaining suspended on our davits, others hauled on the forecastle head, and proceeded. I may mention here that during the work of getting the boats alongside, I happened to look down from the bridge and saw my friend, Mr. Ogden. The day before, he had been trying a new camera he had with him. So I cupped my hands and shouted down, "What about that new camera?" He glanced my way, threw up his hands as if to say he had never thought of it, sped off, and in a few minutes was taking snaps of the boats as they came alongside. They are the only authentic records of the occasion, and surely an amateur photographer never had a more thrilling scene to take. The Carpathia had stopped in mid-Atlantic. It was a beautiful morning, a clear sun burning on the sea and glistening on the icebergs. On every side there were dozens of these monsters, so wonderful to look at, so dreadful to touch. Some boats containing the survivors were alongside. People were climbing up the ship's side, others being pulled up, all wearing lifebelts. And incidentally, it was the wearing of these that protected those who had been so long exposed in the boats and prevented many from dangerous chills. And then, from every quarter, boats were pulling in, making for one common objective, the Carpathia. One thing stands out in my mind about it all, the quietness. There was no noise, no hurry. When our passengers at length came on deck, they were some time before they seemed to realize the stupendous nature of the tragedy. It was too big to assimilate at once. Their hardly awakened senses could not respond to the immensity of the scene. But as soon as reality followed on questionings, I must say our people understood that they mustn't remain spectators, that here was a situation unparalleled in which they must play a part. They set about comforting the rescued, persuading them to take nourishment or stimulant, seeking to soften the grief which wrapped them around. Our doctors must have been relieved to see our passengers using their persuasion and common sense so successfully. They saw the survivors required dry and warm clothing, so off they took them to their own cabins to fit them out with everything they could. All our men passengers gave up their cabins, and many of the ladies doubled up with others so as to leave their own quarters free for the distressed. Every officer, of course, yielded his accommodation. In my cabin were 3 ladies, each of whom were bereaved. Their husbands, all millionaires, had perished, and in addition 1 lady had lost a son. On the other hand, one had her son with her, whose saving had that touch of the dramatic that was in evidence time and again that night. This boy had been separated from his mother, but later on had found a place in a collapsible boat. These things are like ordinary boats as to the hull, except that they are flat-bottomed and their sides are canvas and can be folded down. The sides of the one this boy was in collapsed for some reason, and he, with others, was kneeling on the hull. His position was even more precarious than it sounds, for since they were helpless to propel it in any way, the boat was floating in the near vicinity of the liner and couldn't move away. It was right under her stern, and from this boy I heard a graphic account of how the Titanic upended herself and remained posed like some colossal nightmare of a fish, her tail high in the air, her nose deep in the water, until she dived finally from human sight. That collapsible was fortunate not to have been sucked down with the ship. Probably the suction was lessened by reason of the pause and then the sliding movement she took. At all events, the helpless boat merely bobbed a little dangerously and remained afloat. In a little while, a ship's boat came near. It was hailed, and the boy was taken into her, and the first person whom he saw in this rescuing boat was his own mother. Imagine the joy of that meeting. But it was more than matched by another, rather similar episode of that night. Some of the first boats may have got away not filled to capacity, but later others certainly were overloaded, and there were heart-rending moments when two well-laden boats pulling about encountered poor fellows swimming in that ice-cold sea. In this case I am recounting, a boat's gunwale was seized forward by a swimmer. It was well before dawn. No one could see who it was, but many voices were raised protesting against him being hauled in. "We're full, they cried. "Don't let him come in." One woman in the stern sheets, however, nursing her sorrow of a husband left behind on the sunken ship, begged for the swimmer to be taken in. The pity in her pleading prevailed, and she knew the swimmer had been saved before she sank back into the frozen coma that great tragedy engenders. Hours passed. For nearly 4 hours we sailed round this pack, quite 56 miles. Then we were clear and could set our course for New York. I ought to mention that the Olympic, which at the time of the disaster was some hundreds of miles to the westward, having left New York on the Saturday, had wired us suggesting she should take off the rescued, but I was against any such move. Fortunately, Mr. Ismay, the chairman of the White Star Line, was among those saved, and when I informed him, suggesting that it would be unwise to endeavour to tranship these poor people who had just been saved from the boats, he at once agreed, and told me to request the Olympic to keep out of sight. So on we went, still passing other isolated bergs from time to time. I remember that about noon we passed the Russian steamer Burma, who, bound east, made an endeavour to cut through that ice pack, but he turned out again, and I didn't blame him either. We were able to communicate to the Olympic the bare facts of the disaster, and I also sent the official message to the Cunard Company, together with as many names of the survivors as we then had. This offered the first chance we had of dispatching the news to shore. It was, owing to the short range of wireless then in operation, also the last opportunity we had of establishing communication until Wednesday afternoon. And then we learned how the world had waited in suspense for details, and especially a correct and complete list of passengers and crew who had been saved. After the ice, we ran into that other great enemy of ships at sea, fog. 4 hours it enshrouded us, and again on Wednesday it came down thick, continuing more or less all the way to New York. The dismal, nerve-wracking noise of the whistle every half-minute must have been particularly distressing to the survivors, and I was sorry for their state of mind, having encountered this after all their other experiences. We had taken 3 bodies from the boats, and 1 man died during the forenoon on Monday. All 4 were buried on Monday afternoon, Protestant and Roman Catholic services being held over them. During Wednesday afternoon, we were in communication with the USS Chester, dense fog at the time, and through her were able to send a more complete list of survivors and corrections. We picked up Fire Island light vessel from its foghorn on Thursday afternoon, and about 6 stopped off Ambrose Channel lightship and took on our pilot. And now we got some idea of that suspense everyone was in. Press boats literally surrounded us. I decided that these journalists must not come on board. The comfort of the rescued had to be the first consideration. To have them interviewed by dozens of alert young newspaper men eager to get the most lurid details would cause endless distress, making them live it all over again. It was, of course, only in the nature of the reporter's job to get news, and when I told them they would not be allowed on board, it was amusing to see the tactics some of them adopted to defeat my ruling. At length dawn lit the haggard faces of those who huddled shiveringly in that boat. Only then did the woman see the features of the drenched man she had been chiefly instrumental in dragging from a death by drowning. It was her own husband. It stirred the heart to see the fortitude of the bereaved, much as it sent a glow of pride to listen to some of the tales that were gradually revealed by the survivors of the sights that had been witnessed during those last hours on the sinking ship. Tales of bravery and self-sacrifice that add lustre to the human story, shown by every class. In those hours of trial, facing death, men were equal in heroism, whether they were the humblest or such as had much of this world's possessions. And one wondered, looking into the troubled and sometimes vacant faces of those who were saved, whether they, or those left behind, had the harder part to play. But it is sure that there were many that night who, loaded with riches and honours, showed they possessed the greater gifts of self-sacrifice and self-command. We heard then, and later, of tales of the famous, tales too of the unknown. Of them all, one remains warm in my memory. It concerns a young girl. A boat full of women was ready for lowering from the stricken ship. It was found to be too full, and the order was given for someone to get out. What a moment! It had to be done, for the overfull boat endangered the lives of all. A young lady, a girl really, got up to leave the boat. At once some of the others protested, pleading that she should stay. "No," she said, "you're married and have families. I'm not. It doesn't matter about me." She stepped out of the boat and returned to the deck. She went down with the ship. She gave her life that others might live. No words of mine can add to the beauty of that action. But that night it was duplicated 100 times as the boats went off, until there were no more to go, and those who remained knew all hope of safety was dissipated. The night and the morning were crowded with incidents. Here's one that shows how truth can indeed be stranger than fiction. It also throws a light on the amazing quietness and smoothness with which the crew of the Carpathia went about their task of preparation and rescue. We had sailed from New York on the 11th of April, 1912. It had been a pleasant and smooth passage, save for the intense cold, upon which we all remarked. On the Sunday, 3 days out, we were in reach by wireless of the Titanic. At dinner that night, a message was received from that ship, a private communication. It came from 2 young ladies who were aboard her, and was addressed to their uncle and aunt, Mr. and Mrs. Marshall, who were on the Carpathia, just a cheery greeting, saying how they were enjoying the crossing on the new ship. It was that same night she went down. The Marshalls knew nothing of it. They retired to their state cabin. They went to sleep. The night was calm, the sea was smooth. They slept on through all the preparations that were going on aboard. Among the first of the survivors who came up one of the gangways were the 2 nieces who, a few hours before, had been wirelessing from the Titanic to the Marshalls. While the latter had been sleeping, these young ladies had been through all the agony of the night. It was about 6:30 when the Marshalls awoke. A steward, knocking on the door, aroused them. "What is it?" asked Mr. Marshall. "Your nieces wish to see you, sir," replied the steward. No wonder he was dumbfounded, hardly believing his eyes when he opened the door and looked upon the girls, not crediting his senses as he listened to their story. Looking back on that morning, I am persuaded to emphasize again as the outstanding feature the silence on board. There was absolutely no excitement. At first, no doubt, the enormity of the occurrence stunned the sensibilities of our passengers when they knew of it, while the rescued came solemnly, dumbly, out of a shivering shadow. Afterwards, everyone was too occupied to think. The ladies were very soon self-appointed nursing sisters, getting the newcomers to lie abed, others to rest on deck, and doing what they could to ease suffering and to console. As many of the second and third-class passengers who came aboard were but poorly clothed, blankets and sheets were requisitioned, and many of the ladies started to make clothes. Others went to the third class and busied themselves nursing, clothing, and feeding the children. The cream of human kindness was surely extended that morning, and during the days that followed while we made New York, and through it all that quietness reigned, as though the disaster were so great that it silenced human emotion. It seems incredible that the trying experiences through which so many had passed should not have developed hysterical trouble, in some at least, but it didn't. Indeed, on Tuesday morning, Dr. McGee came to me and made the satisfactory report that all the survivors were physically well. Marvelous. I knew that was the reward of endless attention on his part and that of the entire staff. No one relinquished their utmost efforts. Loyally and cheerfully, every member of the crew, both officers and men, gave of their best. Doctors, pursers, stewards, even the little bellboys, all entertained no thought of rest from the moment I issued my first orders until we had landed the survivors in New York and had again left to take up our interrupted voyage to the Mediterranean. In all that large assembly of differing human beings, I heard of only one instance of selfishness. A certain foreigner who had come aboard bedded himself down in one of the smoke rooms. With an acquisitive eye and disregard of others, he had obtained several blankets for his own comfort. These were draped round his portly figure, when other men found they were devoid of any. He was asked to share up, but adopted the old motto of, "What I have, I hold." There was a small council of war among a few men, but the war was soon over, and the blankets distributed. Which reminds me of another incident in lighter vein, for in the human drama, however near the tragic, there always seems to shoot a ray or two of humour. The man himself told me the experience later, and with the heaviness of the immediate worry off my mind, I couldn't help laughing at the picture his tale called up. It seems that he, having given up his cabin, was bedless. He wandered about the ship looking for some niche in which to curl up, when, mirabile, he espied an empty mattress with some blankets handy. With a sigh of relief he lay down, pulled the blankets over his head, and went peacefully to sleep. Can you imagine his disconcerted surprise when in the morning he woke up to find himself entirely surrounded by women? He'd camped himself out in a portion of the ship which had been reserved for the rescued ladies, and had lain there unnoticed through the night. His retreat was more hurried than strategic. Well, having left the California in charge of the research, hopeless as it was that any man could live in that ice-cold sea, we started on our return. We soon found our passage blocked by a tremendous ice field. There surely never was so much ice in that latitude. We had, of course, seen this field before, but had no means of knowing how compact it was or what was its extent. All we could see was that it stretched to the horizon, a remarkable, awesome sight, with great bergs up to 200 feet in height standing out of the general field, which itself was 6 to 12 feet above the waterline. These little mountains were just catching the early sunshine, which made them take on all manner of wonderful aspects. Minarets like cathedral towers turned to gold in the distances, and here and there some seemed to shape themselves like argosies under full sail. These press boats carried huge placards announcing this was from such and such a paper and that from another. They badgered and pleaded to be allowed to interview me and the passengers, but I could not oblige. 2 pressmen adopted the ruse of coming in the pilot's boat. Now, he was a friend of mine, and it wasn't easy to give him a straight refusal. "Can these fellows come aboard?" he yelled. I cupped my hands and sang out, "Can't hear you." "They want to come aboard. They have friends on the ship." "I can't hear what you say," I shouted, and they knew, I guess, I was prevaricating. When the pilot had the ladder down, however, I expected they would try to get on board after him, so I had a rope bent on from the bottom of the ladder and set 2 boys to haul it in as the pilot came up. You can see what happened. The moment the pilot had lifted his foot from one rung to the next, the boys drew in the rope, and the ladder was hoisted right under the man's heels. One of the 2 men in his boat made a jump and tried to follow, but the ladder wasn't there, and he fell backwards. Of them all, 1 pressman only got aboard. That was later, after we were stopped off quarantine. He made a jump that risked his life and landed on the deck. This was reported to me, and I had him brought to the bridge. I explained my reasons for not having anyone on board, and that I could not allow the passengers to be interviewed. I put him on his honour not to leave the bridge under certain penalties, and I must say he was a gentleman. After we had docked and the passengers had left, I know he made a good story out of his exploit, being the only man to get aboard, and I believe he got complimented, which, after all, he deserved for his temerity. But before we got to quarantine, the weather made another violent change. It brought the most dramatic ending to the tragic episode. First, it began to blow hard, then the rain tumbled down, and as a finale, as though the curtain had to come down under unusual surroundings, it commenced to lightning. Vivid flashes accompanied us all the way up the channel to quarantine, and heavy thunderclaps rolled across the skies. This weather held until we were off the Cunard dock. While on the bridge in the pelting rain, a bundle of letters and a number of telegrams were brought to me. I couldn't examine them at the moment and put them in my pocket. During a lull later on, I ran into my chart room, dipped my hand into my rather full pocket, and drew out one item, one only. It was a cable and came from my wife. Quite satisfied, I returned to my bridge. It was a scene never to be forgotten. Press photographers on the dock let off their flashlight. All round the ship were dozens of tugboats, and before we could tie up, all the Titanic's boats had to be lowered because they were in the way of working the mooring ropes. In each of those boats went two of the Titanic's rescued crew, and to see them pulled into the pitchy night brought back to one's mind again the last occasion when they had been lowered from their own great and magnificent mothership, which was destined never to arrive at this harbour. After 9 o'clock at night, they left us, those who had come out of the terror of shipwreck, and no one was more glad than I to see them passing on to the land. Not, of course, that they personally were well rid of, but to think that the long guardianship was over and they were safe. We had all been strained to the highest pitch of anxiety, and the extent of that concern was now the measure of our relief. The job was done. We at once thought of our own affairs. We had to set out to make the Mediterranean. We had a fairly full complement of passengers. I hastily replenished linen, blankets, etc., that the interruption had utilized from a sister ship. And that same Thursday afternoon, exactly a week from the time of our previous sailing, we left the dock, restored, watered and coaled, and went on with our job. One of our passengers left us, but we took on 2 fresh ones, so that we had a gain of 1. It had indeed been an eventful week. Eventful in the history of shipping, it was to prove. One of the results was that the Board of Trade made new regulations that on every ship at sea there were to be carried sufficient boats to accommodate all passengers and crew. Today it seems incredible that it needed this appalling calamity to bring in such a regulation, and it hardly bears thinking about that if there had been sufficient boats that night when the Titanic was lost, every soul aboard could have been saved, since it was 2.5 hours after she struck that she tilted her mammoth stern into the heavens and sank by the head, taking with her all that were unprovided for. Now, yonder from Portsmouth, even on the little ferry boats that ply between port and the Isle of Wight, there are life-saving appliances for all the passengers the ferries can hold. One other good thing resulted from the disaster. Supported by both Britain and America, there is now a constant ice patrol from March to July or August, always watching along the latitudes where sometimes the ice reaches, and reporting to all shipping whenever there floats out of the icy maw of the far north bergs which might bring to some other ill-fated ship the calamity which met the Titanic. Titanic. Of all the remarkable incidents connected with the short life of that ship of destiny, not the least was her name. If you look in your dictionary, you will find Titans, a race of people vainly striving to overcome the forces of nature. Could anything be more unfortunate than such a name? Anything more significant? That would seem to be the natural end to the story. Yet for me the repercussions went on for some time. Having refueled, filled up our water tanks and so on, we took up our interrupted voyage. In July I returned to England overland from Naples to attend the inquiry held in London into the Titanic's loss. Then followed several weeks of holiday. It was in December that I left the Carpathia, leaving on board the testimonials with which we had been presented by the rescued. There followed a round of social functions. I had to be in Washington on March the 2nd to receive from the hands of President Taft the Congressional Medal of Honor, with the thanks of Congress. The British ambassador, Lord Bryce, took us to the White House to receive this, the highest honor the United States government can bestow, and afterwards we returned to the British Embassy, where I was presented with the American Cross of Honor. My wife and I had a royal time for a few days, and then returned in the Mauretania which I was to command so long and through such exciting times. And it was during those exciting times of the war which were soon to be upon us that the gallant Carpathia was to end her days. She was torpedoed in May 1918 off the south of Ireland. It was a sorry end to a fine ship, yet it is a fitting end to my tale of her career. She'd done her bit, both in peace and war, and she lies in her natural element, resting her long rest on a bed of sand.